Sweatshop Productions brings you Taragam, The Max Ransom Chronicles Book 1 by Jack W. Regan. Read by the author. Chapter 1. Some Dire News.
Ridiculous. Just ridiculous, that's what it is.
Gramkin stumbled on the rocky path, going to one knee and tearing a hole in his breeches.
To wait and let me know the grim state of affairs until it's almost too late to avert disaster.
Short and stocky, the Medjkin sported a wispy gray beard and an outrageously bald head. It was a moonless night. Clouds obscured the stars, and the only light came from the sporadic blinking of chucklebugs, which are like fireflies that light up only when they are amused. It could have been Gramkin's imagination, but they seemed to glow more brightly every time he tripped in the dark.
Hateful creatures,
he muttered. Indignant, he pushed himself to his feet. He brushed his hands, dirtied in the fall, on his leather jerkin, and continued down the path. It was a familiar route, but still he held both arms out, feeling his way through the darkness. He tested the ground with one foot before stepping forward, and saved himself another nasty fall as he discovered a tree limb fallen across the trail. The trees grew thick in this area, and Gramkin shuddered as a sound wafted through the forest. He paused and listened, but heard nothing further except the wind in the trees and the scraping of branches. He continued onward, hurrying to escape the darkness. Then he heard the sound again, a rustling in the bushes, the snap of a twig. Verging on panic, Gramkin broke into a run, stumbling on every other step as his little feet pounded the path. The sounds kept pace, as if something was following him. Something larger, faster. Then all was silent. Gramkin heard only the thud of his own footsteps. Strangely, the silence seemed even more terrifying, and he didn't slow his pace, following the trail by memory and ignoring the low-hanging branches that slapped at him. He wore a small knife at his side, and he felt for it, the coolness of the hilt offering a small comfort. He rounded a bend in the trail and came to a sudden halt. Something tall and gaunt stood in his way, arms outstretched, giving a spectre-like appearance in the darkness. In one hand it held a long staff, and, raising it, tapped it once on the path. Immediately the area was illuminated, and Gramkin risked an upward glance.
Zohar!
The wizard looked displeased. His long beard bristled, and his unruly eyebrows sloped disapprovingly.
Gramkin, what are you doing wandering about the forest in the middle of the night? Where are you going?
Zohar's voice sounded like dry parchment being crumpled in a fist.
I am on Medjkin business,
Gramkin gasped, relieved by Zohar's appearance, but annoyed at the questioning.
And if you must know, I am headed for Ransom Hall.
It must be vital to warrant such a dangerous journey, Zohar said. You are fortunate. I happen to be going that way myself. Have you not heard of the recent Phantor activity in the area? I had an encounter with them just this evening.
Gramkin had recovered sufficiently to remember his pride, and he huffed.
Quite important, actually. The annual Medjkin Games are scheduled for tomorrow, and we seem to be completely out of cheese. You know everyone will be expecting a large variety of cheeses. We Medjkins are known for it.
Cheese?
Zohar's beard rustled indignantly.
Foolish Medjkin! Taragam teeters on the brink of disaster, and you worry about cheese.
Gramkin blinked.
Disaster?
But I've said too much.
Zohar cleared his throat.
Here I chide you for wandering through the forest at night, and then continue to detain you. Come, I'll escort you the final distance to Ransom Hall.
Ransom Hall was a large stone castle on top of a hill. One side of the hill broke off abruptly and formed a steep cliff, at the base of which lapped the murky waters of Lake Dismal. Around the remainder of the hill circled a dry moat, which was separated from the lake by a man-made dam. The moat could be flooded at a moment's notice by raising the floodgate and letting the water pour in. A drawbridge crossed the moat, and across this ran Zohar and Gramkin. Even though the hour was late, lights burned in the windows of the castle.
"Someone's up," Zohar said. "Perhaps Lord Ransom has company."
Well, I hope they haven't eaten all the cheese,
Gramkin said, his small legs struggling to keep up with the wizard's lengthy stride. Zohar sighed.
"Enough with the cheese. We have much more serious issues at hand."
Gramkin started to ask what kind of issues, but was too out of breath. At last they stood at the massive front door. Zohar took a deep breath and used his staff as a knocker. To Gramkin, who was expecting only the sound of a staff against a wooden door, the sound was enormous. It boomed through the mansion, causing even more lights to appear in windows. A minute passed before the door was flung open. A guard stood there, his sword drawn and ready.
"Who goes there?"
Over the guard's shoulder, Zohar saw someone else approaching, a tall, broad-shouldered man with short dark hair and a small goatee. The man's demeanor marked him as a leader. Recognizing him, Zohar deflected the guard's blade with his staff and boldly stepped past him.
"Lord Ransom!"
"Who is it that interrupts my dinner party with such rude manners?" demanded Lord Ransom, continuing forward. He smiled when he caught sight of the wizard. "Zohar, I should have known. You were never one for the strict social graces."
"I offer my apologies, Lord Ransom. My entrance must seem a little untoward."
"Entrance? I was referring to the late hour. The festivities are drawing to an end."
"Festivities?"
"Yes, dinner and entertainment. Most of the guests have already left, and we were just cleaning up. Didn't you get the invitation I sent?" Zohar shook his head apologetically.
"I did not. I do travel quite a bit."
Lord Ransom shrugged. "Well, no matter. What brings you here, then? Not bad news, I hope."
"I'm afraid so."
Zohar moved farther into the room, and the guard closed the door.
"Might I speak to you in private?"
Lord Ransom raised an eyebrow. "That's serious, eh? Very well. We can talk in my study." He turned and led the way down the hall. Gramkin trailed unseen behind the two men. Lord Ransom's study was a magnificent room constructed of red cherry wood and furnished with leather-upholstered furniture. Bookshelves lined the walls, and books lined the shelves. New and old, thick and thin, these books represented the ancient knowledge of Taragam, volumes of history, collections of poetry and prose. An avid collector of literature, Lord Ransom had even tried his hand at crafting a bit of his own, and several of his own works appeared amid the lists of titles.
"Your library grows more impressive each time I visit," Zohar said. "And speaking of such..."
He reached into the folds of his cloak and removed a small leather-bound book.
"I found this last month during my travels."
He handed the book to Lord Ransom, who examined it with growing excitement.
"The Compendium of Magic, Volume 13, he breathed, taking the book.
It was a smallish volume, its leather cover dyed blue. There was gold etching on the facing that shimmered in the firelight. Lord Ransom opened the book and flipped a few pages.
"I've searched everywhere for this. It's the final volume, the only one missing from my set.
You have my gratitude, Zohar. You are a book hunter of the finest caliber." Zohar chuckled.
"High praise coming from you, Lord Ransom. It cost a fair sum, I'll admit, and I had to travel to some rather unsavory corners of Taragam to find it. There are forces at work who would be most displeased if they knew of its existence, and especially so if they knew it was in your possession."
"A rare book as well as intrigue," Lord Ransom smiled. "Doesn't get any better than that."
"I'm pleased you like it," Zohar said. "But about the reason for my visit."
"Of course." Lord Ransom regretfully closed the book and set it aside on his desk. "What is so important that it brings you in haste in the middle of the night?"
"There's been increasing Fantor activity in the south, Lord Ransom. Just last week, a group of cutters was wiped out in a surprise attack on the northern border as they were going about their normal duties of cutting back the advance of the Dark Wood."
"They didn't stray past the borders of the wood?"
"Not that we could tell. Of course, there were no survivors left to tell the story once I arrived."
"You are the one who found them?"
Well, I discovered the site of their demise, if that's what you mean, Zohar said grimly. There wasn't much left of the poor fellows. Some cutting tools and a few scattered pieces of clothing was about it. Obvious signs of a struggle covered the ground. Trampled grass, fresh dirt turned up, drag marks.
Drag marks?
Zohar nodded. Drag marks. Long trails in the turf, as if heavy objects had been dragged along the ground.
And where do these trails lead?
Into the dark wood. Trees must eat as well.
Both men fell silent, Lord Ransom understanding the implication, and Zohar letting it sink in. Zohar broke the silence.
It is becoming increasingly obvious that, along with the Phantors, the Dark Wood is regaining its power, feeding off an increasingly evil presence in Taragam.
At these terrible words, Gramkin let out a squeak. Lord Ransom frowned. Is someone else in the room? Zohar looked back and saw Gramkin cowering behind him.
I apologize, Lord Ransom. I met this Medskin on the path to Ransom Hall and escorted him the rest of the way. I was unaware he had followed us into your private study.
With his staff, he made a shooing motion toward Gramkin, who dodged out of the way and scuttled to the door. Once back out in the hall, Gramkin sniffed. Unless he was badly mistaken, the smell of cheese was in the air. There was, no doubt, a large spread laid out for the dinner party, and he hoped to be able to lay his hands on a large portion of it. Then he could sneak out and make his way home before anyone noticed he had been away. Gramkin followed his nose to the banquet hall, which was still decorated with bright ribbons and festive greenery. All the guests had gone home, however, and the only people in sight were a few workers who moved along the tables, cleaning and clearing dishes. Careful to stay out of sight, Gramkin moved cautiously along the tables, but the only cheese he found was scattered crumbs on the floor and some on a table where the platter must have rested.
If I could just find that platter, he thought, I'd have more than enough cheese to see us through the games tomorrow.
Finding the kitchen was an easy task, and finding the cheese was even easier, given Gramkin's finely attuned sense of smell. No one was in the kitchen when he entered, but Gramkin was still cautious as he made his way across the room to a large cupboard. He sniffed around the edges of the door for a moment, and then slowly opened it. There lay a huge platter of cheeses, blocks of cheese, cubes of cheese, cheese slices of varying thickness. Gramkin's mouth watered.
I'd better sample a bit of each variety, he murmured, just to make sure it's worthy of being served at the games.
With this noble intention, he snatched up a slice of cheese and fondled it a little before nibbling off the teeniest corner. His eyes rolled back in his head with delight as he savored the rich, pungent flavor. A hand grabbed him roughly by the shoulder, causing Gramkin to yelp and leap into the air with surprise. A voice hissed from behind.
I've caught you this time, you little swine!
Thank you for listening to this episode of Taragam by Jack W. Regan. Visit us on the web at www.taragam.com. Music was by Kevin MacLeod. Visit his website at www.incompetech.com. Taragam is copyrighted 2009.